Welcome everyone to this class series, those of you that are joining here and also those of you that are on Zoom. This is a very fun class that I've been looking forward to for some months now. I was moving apartments just a few months ago, and I stumbled upon this copy of the Bible, which has been around for some time, which was a gift from a very well-meaning Christian friend. And I had never attempted opening it in the last many years. I think I mentioned in an email I wrote to many friends that when I came to the US, the first couple of years, I would be very pleased to find a copy of the Bible in many of the hotel rooms where I stayed. And I thought, this is great. I didn't bring any books with me. Let me try and read the scripture. And it was not as inviting. And anyway, a few months ago, this was probably during the holy season, the holiday season, that I stumbled upon this book. And often I've contemplated, I don't have a lot of space in my apartment. Do I need to keep this? Because I've never opened it, never read it in itself. You know, I obviously read a lot of master's teachings and a lot of Swamiji's writings, but it has never been as inviting to me. But somehow, just this one day, it was just lying there, and I picked it up and I started reading, especially the parts of the New Testament, Jesus' life and his teachings. And something spoke to me, and then I took it to my seclusion and I started reading a lot of master's commentaries on the Bible again. And it dawned on me how much inspiration there is in the scripture, which often surpasses the mind. It is not so much just the stories or the phrases that we often hold on to, or even inspiration that we find in the ideas that are presented, but more simply in the vibration of a scripture. The Bible is an interesting scripture because it's extremely nonlinear. It's not even one book. It's a collection of many, many books written over a long span of time, over thousands of years perhaps. Before we talk about that, I decided, this inspiration came to me today morning in my meditation, that I should open every class with a joke. And because I realized, now Swami's Jyotish and Devi, for those of you that don't know, if you're watching this online later on, they're spiritual directors of Ananda, and their Jyotish is a successor of Swami Kriyananda, who's a direct disciple of Paramhansa Yogananda. So all of what I'm sharing, everything we'll discuss here are based on these teachings. I realized how many jokes he shares are about Jesus in the Bible, and so all of these jokes are from them. So I have absolute license to share them in any context. So the first joke, maybe some of you have heard this, so I'm not going to share the joke that he has been sharing a lot recently with the Pope and the Vatican. Maybe some of you have not heard it. We'll get to it maybe in a future class. But this one is about Jesus and Moses and another old man who go to play golf one day. So first, Moses hits the ball, and then the ball is rolling on the grass, and it comes across a huge puddle of water. And as soon as the ball just pauses there, and the water parts. And the ball rolls gently, and it goes till the hole, but it doesn't go inside. It just stops a couple of inches before. And then Moses obviously is disappointed. And then Jesus comes, and he hits the ball. And the ball does the same thing. It goes to the puddle of water, and this time the ball just walks on the water. It just rolls over the surface of the water, and then to the hole, and then again, it just stops 1 inch before the hole. It's still, even that ball does not reach the hole. And then the old man comes, he just sort of strolls onto the field, and then he hits the ball, and the ball doesn't go anywhere. It just goes a few feet. Then suddenly a hawk comes, and it picks the ball up, and it puts on a tree. It gets caught in a bush. And then suddenly, there's a huge wind. The ball is dropped from the tree. It falls on the ground, and a frog picks it up. And then it goes into this puddle of water. And then the frog swims and takes the ball onto the other side. And the frog also takes it to the hole, but it does not put it in. It just places it 1 inch before the hole, just where Jesus' ball was. And then, at this point, Moses and Jesus are just watching, and there's a gopher that just comes from under the ground, and it takes the third ball, the old man's ball, and just pushes it into the hole. And then Moses looks at Jesus and says, I hate playing golf with your dad. Anyway, if you did not get that joke, you're in the right class, because maybe we will cover some of the basics. The Bible is such an interesting book. I was reading, of course, a lot of commentaries of Yogananda preparing for this class, but also just generally about the Bible, because as you can tell, perhaps, I did not come from a culture where it is as common. I grew up in a very traditional Hindu household in India. The Bible is just a word that I had heard. I had no idea what the book was like. Even Christian traditions were not as well known in India. The only thing I perhaps knew was that Jesus was born on Christmas. That was the extent of my knowledge on Christianity for a long time until I read the autobiography of a yogi and I got drawn to this particular path and Yogananda's teachings. And Yogananda emphasized a lot on Christ's teachings. Of course, Christ and the teachings of the Bible were very central to his mission and the way he taught and all that he brought to the West. So obviously, I didn't have a lot of context or background with the Bible, and I was reading a lot on the internet about, just to get an idea. Of course, the Bible is not just the most widely known, widely read scripture, it is the most printed book ever in history, just by 10 or 20 times more than any other book ever printed. It's the book that most people in the world own. How many copies of Bible are there? There's just a lot of interesting statistics. I'm not going to share all of that, but it is so all-pervasive, especially in the Western world, but of course Christians are there everywhere in the world today. It's just one world that we live in. The geography does not really limit people's ability to culturally tune into whatever they want to tune into, and there are Christians everywhere. Obviously, the Bible is such a quintessential scripture that so much of the world's population is tuning into. And what is it in this book that they find inspiration in? Of course, we are going to explore a lot of it from the yogic standpoint, from how Yogananda taught these teachings, but also just the power of scripture itself. What does the Bible have to offer, and how do we access it, especially that inspiration, that power that the scripture has for so many years? In fact, I had no idea until I started researching and preparing for this class. I call it research, perhaps it's obvious, and all of you were very aware of it even before, that the Old Testament contains 39 different books, and the New Testament has 22 different books. Again, for those of you, if you are brand new to exploring the Bible has two major sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the Old Testament is the part of the book that is primarily predating Christ. It's before the life of Christ, and most of it is the prophets, Moses, Abraham, and other prophets that came before Christ in that part of the world in Israel where all of this originated. And the New Testament is the life of Christ and everything that happened afterwards. So the Old Testament is a holy book not just for Christians, all sects of Christians, but also for Judaism, and every branch and sect of Judaism treats the Old Testament as their sacred scripture. And of course, the New Testament is the book that the Christians primarily refer to, people that follow the teachings of Christ. Christ also taught from the Old Testament. Somewhere, there's so many jokes that come to me right now because I guess it's a very common theme for jokes. Jesus was a Jew. It is something that people often don't pay conscious attention to. I was thinking about a joke because I read somewhere on a comic strip, they don't make Jews like Jesus anymore. There was another comic strip from a while ago that I saw on the internet. This one was, I think, this is about, I don't mean to make any social or political commentary here, it's just a funny joke. Jesus had two dads, but he turned out fine. But, what makes something a scripture? Because if you especially examine Bible and look at all the different books from the Old Testament, it is not actually easy to comprehend or understand. That's what I realized later on when I was able to pick up and go to the right sections of the Bible. This copy that I'm holding, again, I wanted to also just say as a matter of introduction, I am not an expert on the Bible. I have not actually read the Bible cover to cover. I have read the New Testament, at least in its entirety at some point, because it's actually not the New Testament. I shouldn't say that. The four canonical Gospels, we'll talk about all of that. The four Gospels from which we draw all of Christ's life and all the things that happened during his time. That's not a very large part of the Bible. It's fairly short, and that's the part that most of us are familiar with, and that's all I've read. But there's a lot more I want to tell you in terms of just the size here. So this entire first part of the book, this is the Old Testament until this part for those of you that can see. And then even here, only this much is the four canonical gospels. So there's this whole book, and I realized the reason why it was so inaccessible for me was because I was always trying to go through the Old Testament, which was a very large part of the book. And Yogananda did make a lot of references to things from the Old Testament, but primarily it was all in the context of Jesus' teachings. So we will discuss some of it today. This class, the first class, I have a skeleton for what we'll be doing in these 4 weeks. And from next week, we'll also get to share some of Swami's music and look at the life of Christ and get into a lot of the incidents that happened and trying to explore his teachings from the view of yoga and meditation and the Eastern teachings. In this first class, I want to just introduce and present the context and perhaps talk a little bit about the Old Testament and the New Testament, setting up the overall context for exploring the scripture itself. And if you were to pick up the book, that's my hope, which is that we all can find this book inspiring, at times when we want to really just tune into the presence of Christ, when we want to find inspiration in that way. We all can just pick up the Bible and, have that capacity to find things that inspire us in our own spiritual lives. So even before we go there, I think it is important. I'm going to just take 10 minutes to talk about some of the general premise, which both Yogananda and Swami Kriyananda talked about a lot, and which is relevant in terms of the Bible to understand what Scripture is. How do we approach it? Who has the authority to interpret Scripture? And more importantly, how do we really tune into the teachings of a Scripture? Because something like the Bible, especially the Old Testament, is a mix of allegory, mythology, history, fiction, parables. There's just a lot of it, just mixed all together as one whole. Now, how do we directly apply all of this into our lives? Is it important to, first of all, analyze and separate it out? And if we cannot do that, how do we actually navigate that landscape of all these different ways in which the scriptures present truth to us? So even before we start, what is a scripture? The word, as an English word, I don't know what the dictionary defines a scripture as, but Yogananda specifically talked about scripture in a very particular way. Yogananda, to give you more context on how he approached the Bible, I think many of you know that when he came to the US, the first thing when he came to Southern California, when he bought this property in Mount Washington that many of us have visited, he hosted an Easter morning service. And it's a very interesting service because he had actually not secured the amount, down payment, to pay for the property. The deed was not finalized, but he already just took all of his students up to Mount Washington, and on 6 a.m., at 6 a.m. on an Easter morning, I think it was 1934, I'm not sure, or maybe 1928 or somewhere around there, he hosted this Easter morning service. And oftentimes, over the years, I myself have read a lot of historians or other people that have written commentaries on Yogananda's life that talk about how Yogananda was so masterful in being able to adapt the Eastern teachings in order to speak to the Western audience in their language, speaking of their teacher, which was Jesus. And Swami Kriyananda strictly corrected and condemned those points of views. And it's important for us to note that, especially if you are a disciple and a yogi that is trying to tune into the teachings of Yogananda and practice these teachings, because it makes it sound almost incidental. It makes it sound as if Yogananda had not come to the West, he would have never cared to talk about Jesus, or that he was somehow appealing or appeasing to people with things that they were already in agreement with. That way he could present his teachings. A lot of these things are presented. It's a subtle inference. It's not that they were explicitly being stated, but it is important for us to understand, especially when we go back to the autobiography of a yogi and we understand the whole sequence of everything that Yogananda describes, his own incarnation and all of that, we realize it's not incidental if one were to truly read it with that perceptive eye to understand the mission of not just Yogananda, but of all these great gurus. The whole autobiography of a yogi, when Babaji says it's time for the world to know about me so you can write the book. But all of this happened because Jesus was in communion with Babaji. That's what the autobiography of a yogi says. And we read that in Ananda when we do our Sunday services. Every week we do the ceremony called the Festival of Light, where we read that section from the autobiography of a yogi of Jesus being in communion with Babaji and the two masters working on the salvation of this whole planet. Now, it is not a metaphor, and that's why we reiterate it every week. It's not a symbol, it's not an allegory. The two masters are in fact in communion. Jesus is in communion with Babaji, who is still living with the same body for hundreds of years. And the two masters, it is through their will that this lineage, the tradition of Kriya Yoga, the tradition of meditation yoga being propagated in the West, all of it is through the will of Jesus and Babaji. And even moving a little farther down, when Babaji meets Yukteswar, again, I'm not going to go through the whole story. I assume most of you know what I'm talking about. In the Kumbh Mela, Yukteswar was not even a monk at that time. He was, I think, 40 or 42 years old. He was fairly young at this point. And, Yukteswar, in all of his humility, he tells the story as if he had a lot of, he had a lot of criticism in himself. He was thinking in Kumbh Mela around the time when he was about to meet Babaji, he was not seeing the truth and the high teachings of India in their light, but often being critical of how many people were using the blanket of religion or spirituality to not really be creative or help mankind. And then he was saying, how great are the scientists of the West? They're perhaps doing more of God's work than all these holy men who are pretending to lead a spiritual life in India. And at that time, Babaji intercedes, and obviously he offers Yukteswar Giri a correction, and he helps him be humble about it. And then he says, I see that you have interest in the West. Perhaps you can write a book. He gives him a commission to write the Holy Signs, which is a very small book, but I was telling somebody it's very dense just before the class started. And then Babaji tells Yukteswar Giri, in the same conversation he says, I want you to write a book that shows the essential unity of Eastern and Western religion, the teachings of the great scriptures of the East and the West. And also in that same context, he says, I'm going to send you a student. I'm going to send you somebody that you can send to the West in order to further this mission. Now, all of this is important. I'm stating this only because we want to understand the central role of the Bible and Jesus' teachings in the tradition of yoga. It's not an afterthought. The reconciliation is not that, oh, look at that. Bible also seems to agree with this true teaching of yoga that has existed in India. Yes, that is true. But the life of Jesus and tuning into Christ consciousness and everything that he brought is as central to the path of Kriya Yoga and the tradition that Yogananda brought, as are the Indian scriptures. So anyway, Yukteswar Giri writes this book, and in fact, it's an interesting story. I think Yukteswar Giri meets Babaji in the month of August or somewhere around there, and then he actually wrote this book in 3 or 4 months after that. He wrote this in the month of later on, winter that year, and the whole book was written and proofread and edited and went to printing in a matter of a week or 2 weeks. This was not a book. And then Yukteswar Giri, in his own words, this is not from autobiography, but from a different book, he talks about how he was so intimidated by this assignment. Who am I to write about the Eastern and the Western scriptures? And then he realized that the great masters can write through him. And he says it all came to him. It just rushed into his consciousness, and he just put pen to paper, and this book was there. And immediately it went into publication. So this book was not a thesis. It was not a research paper that is there's a conglomeration of all of Yukteswar Giri's life's work. This was an inspired work that just came to him in that one moment, where he could show that unity of East and West. Now, I'm saying all of this in the context of how we approach a scripture. What is a scripture? And that in itself is the best example of how this book was born, because a true scripture is not a theological treatise. A true scripture is not simply the ideas presented or what happened. It's not just a historical account, but it has a living power. It is very hard to talk about it or explain it in more detail than that. In the New Path, Swami Kriyananda spoke about the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, which are scriptures from India. He said whenever he would pick these books up, he would just feel this light, blue light surrounding him, just this pure light of God that would immediately, he would see it physically emanating from the book, and that would start emanating from him when he would read it. And he said that even about Shakespeare's work, because he considered Shakespeare to be a very evolved saintly soul, and that's why he often liked reading Shakespeare. Now, the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, of course, there's a lot of allegory to it, a lot of spiritual teachings that have been preserved for many, many millennia. But if you think about it, it's a story. Ramayana is the story of Rama, he was a great king, and then he married Sita, she got abducted, and then he fought this battle, he brought his princess back. It's a story. It's like a fairy tale. So how does that power reside in that story? Because it is not just the story. There is a living power in everything, and it is not one thing or another. It's not just the Sanskrit verses, it's not the names of the characters, it's not just the sequence of the story. It is all of it, but it's something beyond all of it. It is a way that the great ones, people of true realization, have transmitted their consciousness through the word, through living word, whether it's the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita or the Ramayana or the holy science or the autobiography of a yogi. When Swami Kriyananda met Yogananda, when he read the autobiography and he went across the country to meet his guru, and then obviously I think most of you will remember the story, he says, I felt the vibrations in the book. I felt your vibrations in the, it was so powerful, that's what he says. And then Yogananda says, because it has my vibrations in it. And that's what we are talking about when we are referring to scripture. So again, I'm sharing all of this because we want to approach a scripture with that sense of respect, appreciation, humility, receptivity, to be able to receive and tune in. There are a lot of ideas presented. The point is not to somehow put our mind to sleep and be blind in our belief, or somehow to just go by the literal meaning of the words that are presented, but just in our own hearts, focus on that receptivity when we open a scripture, because there's so much that the scripture is trying to give us. And it's like a diamond. Every angle of it has a different facet. Every time you pick it up, it has something new to offer to you. It is the same words. Like I said, the canonical gospels are just this small part of the book, but still, they have so much power. How many thousands, millions of people over history have taught from it, spoken about it, the life of Christ that is still inspiring so many across the world 2,000 years after his passing. How many Christians there were in 100 AD, in 300 AD, you go back into history and then you realize the grassroots, soul by soul, the progression of that avatar's mission that has all been carried out through the living vibration, a major part of which is the book itself, is the Holy Bible. Now, moving on, what is the authority with which one can interpret the scripture? Yogananda famously said, Christ was crucified once and his teachings have been crucified every day since, because obviously somewhere in there has been a confusion. Often in his writings you also see he was almost funny in his way of writing these things. He would refer to churchianity. He would distinguish Christianity versus the teachings of all the Christian churches that existed at that time as being separate, that the interpretation and the way in which these teachings were carried through by human instruments was fairly imperfect. So what gives Yogananda the authority to say that this is not what Christ meant and this is a misinterpretation? And it goes back to where the authority really comes from. Because if a scripture is one that has the living vibrations from a higher state of consciousness, then the only person that can speak for it is somebody who has attunement to that state of consciousness, whether it's Yogananda or a different saint, because it cannot be interpreted simply on the level of theology. Swami Kriyananda often would quote the story of Saint Teresa of Avila. I think Master himself wrote about it, actually, if I'm right. He wrote it in the Second Coming of Christ. Saint Teresa of Avila, she used to journal about her experiences that she had, her mystical experiences. And at some point, as she was having these deeper and deeper experiences, she started referring to the formless Christ. She was no longer referring to Jesus in her experiences and in her entries. And this obviously was a cause for concern, and her superiors in the institution did not take to it really well. And finally, after a long time, somebody in the institution at that time, they were able to find references in the writings of St. Thomas of Aquinas, where he was also referring to Christ as being formless and as that experience being a state that one passes into after they have transcended a lot of those material limitations, after they have evolved spiritually enough. So at that point, then it validated what Saint Teresa was experiencing. But that story and that incident presents that real conundrum of who gets to say. And it also shows for the incredible humility of the various Christian saints who were able to carry on that mystical tradition and the living presence even while being in the institution. I've been reading a biography of Therese Neumann in the last few months, and it is so interesting. It's a very, very fascinating account of her entire life starting from her childhood. She knew from a very early age that she wanted to be a nun. And she wanted to be a Catholic nun, and her whole life was set. She knew that that's what her life's mission was, but she never could be one. She never was associated with any order or any tradition at all, because at a very early age, I think perhaps even at the age of 9 and the age of 16, she had such severe illnesses of the body that disqualified her from being in the convent. She had a stroke, she was in the bed for many years, and by her early 20s, when she was healed of these very, very major illnesses, that's when she started having her stigmata. So, at no point in her life did she actually have any formal position with any church. She just there's this tiny little chapel in her village in Germany. I'll say the name wrong if I try. But there was this father who recognized her, who recognized who she was and who supported her. But then there was no place for her in the institution, in that theology. Nobody could tell her, unless you went to the convent, unless you served for so many years, you could just go from this grade to that grade and you could do all of this. Then you could become a nun and then you could join this order. That was the only formality that they knew. But there was something that she was experiencing that was so mystical in nature that the churchianity of that time had no definition or place for. And it was so interesting. I was reading these stories about her, but people knew, and that's the vibration that saints carry. People knew. People would just come to her. They would flock to see her. When she would come sit in the church to pray, everybody would want to sit next to her or behind her, and people would want to touch her robe. So at one point, it became so difficult for her to be in the church that she had a secluded corner where she could pray, just to avoid the public eyes and the attention and the chaos that it would cause. So she had to be sectioned off just to maintain the civility in that tiny little chapel in that village in Germany. But it speaks for the teachings of Christ and how saints tune into it versus the institution, the interpretation, the theology, the doctrine of divinity, and everything else, which somehow has come to define and govern the interpretation of the scriptures for us. And in fact, I was reading Swami's Revelations of Christ this past week, and he quotes some famous journal in the 40s or the 50s when Yogananda visited Therese Neumann. There was this Catholic journal that was writing about that experience in a very critical way. And that after the autobiography of a yogi was published, so it must have been in the 50s or the 60s, the exact quote was, "As if a Hindu yogi could truly have a divine Catholic vision." For those of us sitting in the room, we can chuckle about it. But then you think about how the formal institutionalization of religion itself can often take away from the vibration and the essence of being able to tune into a scripture. So we have to come to it from that fresh lens. And again, I'm saying all of this in terms of setting the context for what Yogananda brought for us. Because oftentimes, as I already mentioned, as somebody who is not an authority on the Bible, I've had people who have come to this temple. They would often ask me questions, Yogananda did not interpret every verse in the Bible. With the Patanjali and the Gita, he almost interpreted every verse, every significant verse. So in a way, those teachings are more comprehensive, whereas with the Bible, he did not actually talk of each and every verse. For those of you that are interested, there is a book called The Second Coming of Christ. That is an edited work that was published later after Yogananda's passing. But from the years, if I'm right, in the mid-30s to the mid-40s, Yogananda had his magazine. It was, at some point, it was called Inner Culture, and then it was called East West. He used to run this monthly magazine, and in that, he started writing Bible commentaries. And all of that is collected, and those collected writings were originally called The Second Coming of Christ. But now there is also another book published by Self-Realization Fellowship that is called The Second Coming of Christ, which I have not read, so I'm not commenting on it. But it's a much, much, much bigger volume than the original writings that Yogananda had. And what Yogananda wrote in these magazine excerpts were also extremely thorough in terms of yogic teachings and what he was sharing. And it was actually sequential. You can see it was very inspired, but also month on month on month, he was building on what he wrote last month, what he wrote then. I don't think he wrote every month, but he wrote about 50 to 100 articles over this period of time, which is what we call the Second Coming of Christ. So when somebody like Yogananda starts interpreting these these scriptures for us, they come from a place of authority. It won't reconcile with what one might know, what somebody else told, what this particular section of Bible says. Often the questions asked, where I was going is, often we have people here, especially who have more experience or sort of much more background in the Christian tradition. Like somebody many years ago, was not buying reincarnation, and I then, I very enthusiastically quoted all of what Yogananda provided as proof of reincarnation in the Bible. And this person wrote a long email back to me with this verse and that verse and so much more that obviously I had no capacity to comment on, because neither had I heard of those verses. I have no familiarity with the Old Testament. And then he was interpreting them in a way that somehow in his mind seemed to negate the idea of reincarnation. So again, I'm saying all of this because I don't think the point is, especially with most of the Bible, because of how non-linear and how they're all from different points in time, it would be impossible. And also Yogananda did not interpret it in that way, in that same way of trying to go through verse after verse, giving some kind of deep philosophical meaning to each verse and building on it. He did that with other scriptures like the Gita and Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. But I don't think, neither did he do that with the Bible, nor I think it would be beneficial. So we certainly, I cannot discuss anything that Yogananda did not talk about. And I'm just going to assume that it's perhaps not as relevant for us. And interestingly, I was also reading another article that Swami Kriyananda wrote, where he was talking about the book of Revelation and Old Testament. And Swami Kriyananda made an interesting reference. He said, my guru did not interpret a lot of these verses. He did not talk a lot about the Old Testament. However, he said Dr. Lewis was a scholar in the Bible. He told me after Yogananda's passing, he was able to interpret a lot of these verses and talk about their allegorical meaning. And if you go to the internet, there's again tons of recordings of Dr. Lewis's lectures, and perhaps Swami is referring to things that even happened in person that are not available in those recordings. So, I'm saying all of that because there is perhaps more deeper meaning, allegory, and symbolism in a lot of verses and parts of the Bible that Yogananda did not talk about. But for all our purposes, it doesn't matter, because there is truth in all of it, and there's so much that has been offered to us by Yogananda and through this tradition that there's a lot for us to draw from. And from the next week on, we will primarily focus on the 4 canonical Gospels, which are very important, and we look at the life of Christ, because ultimately, especially the way Yogananda taught, we are tuning in to the teachings of the Old Testament and all of it also through the lens of Christ's teachings. If you were to explore, especially the way Yogananda wrote his commentary in the Second Coming of Christ, he would often always talk about some verse from Matthew, Mark, or Luke, the 4 main Gospels, and then he would start quoting the Old Testament, just the way Jesus did, because Jesus did teach from the Old Testament. That was the only scripture that there was at that time. So that's where I'm presenting this, because that's where that's the way in which we can tune in and draw that inspiration as well. one other joke that Yogananda had a lot of jokes. I'll perhaps save some for the future classes, but I was reading one more joke from the early talks of Yogananda. There was apparently this very famous evangelical speaker named Billy Sunday. And so Yogananda would often share this joke in public and get a good laugh around it. Billy Sunday went to heaven, to the pearly gates, and then Peter was standing there. And Billy asked Peter, I'm supposed to go to heaven. And Peter says, your name's not there on the list, I'm sorry. And then Billy says, how is that possible? I have sent hundreds of people to heaven myself. Why is my name not on the list if I've sent them to heaven? And then Peter just looks at him and says, maybe you sent them to heaven, but they have not arrived here yet. Anyway, so, I'll share one more joke since I'm talking about that right now. Asha would often say, I think his name was Garrison Keillor, he was a famous speaker. She would quote him in many of her talks. His famous one-liner, it is funny, but also it's quite insightful. He said, thinking that you can go to a church and become a Christian is not different from thinking that you can sit in your garage and become a car. So there's this attunement that we are talking about of how you approach a scripture, because the way we receive from it is vibrational. There is a lot that we can absorb, receive, tune into with the scripture, but also there is the role of the guru. That's really what I wanted to highlight. In the Indian tradition, the guru is always considered an illuminator. A guru is considered a source of light. The word guru itself is somebody who opens your eyes. That's the root of the word. So for our purposes, the guru is like a flashlight. So you might be holding the greatest scripture on the whole planet, but without the flashlight, without any source of light, there is no way you can read it. There is no way those teachings are accessible to us without that light. And in this case, our light is Yogananda and his commentaries and his teachings. So we want to be approaching and tuning into the scripture through that light, because without that, there is no authority. Without that, there is no way to tell truth from untruth, from interpretation. It was very interesting for me how fascinating the whole Christian world is. Maybe some of you are a lot more familiar with this than I am, because even the way the verses are translated, there's a very, I'll just take one verse, for example, that we read in our Sunday services often. The light shineth in darkness, but the darkness comprehended it not. That's how we translate that particular verse. And it makes a lot of sense, because it's a very, very subtle teaching. Because it is not that God does not exist in ignorance, but that the capacity to perceive that light has to come from within. The light cannot push itself on top of ignorance and eradicate it. It's a very subtle teaching that the Bible is talking about. And you can read many, many different versions, including this one. I didn't talk about this. This is a King James version. I think this is considered one of the good editions of the Bible. I've never read anything else, and at least the people that I heard from and I respected Ananda have always recommended this, so I'm glad I had this one to look at. But I know there are many, many other interpretations and translations, not interpretation, translations of the Bible. You can find this verse, I don't know which exact verse number or where it is in the Bible, but I was recently looking it up. This one verse, there's no translation that actually translates this the way we read it. It says the light cannot, and I'm not able to recollect it right now. I should have looked it up before coming here, because some of them were like so far from anything that would make any spiritual sense to us. The darkness rejects the light. They would add their own interpretation into what that original, whatever language that was, Aramaic or Greek or whatever the original verse in Bible was written in. Even the way it is translated, it is so different. In fact, for some reason, just a few weeks ago, I was giving Sunday service, somewhere at a different place, not our temple. And I was reading this particular section. The reading on that day was, how grace came through Jesus. The law was given to Moses, and grace came to us through Jesus. And I somehow, because I knew I was going to teach this class, I started reading that section of the Bible and the commentaries, and somewhere I ended up somehow on the internet reading this whole article on the word grace, just on the word grace and how commonly it is used, especially in the New Testament with reference to Jesus Christ. And this particular author, it was actually interesting. It was not as confused as most Bible translations tend to be. He was talking about the root of that word. I can't remember it right now. I think it's chelis or something like that in Greek. It's a Greek word. And he says, we call it grace, but actually in Greek, in the culture of that time, it refers to a gift. And it's not just a gift, because oftentimes in many Bible verses, we'll discuss these things later on in the upcoming classes. There is this concept of receiving the grace, and through the grace of Jesus, people healing, and later on, especially after when you go to the life of Paul and others after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, all the things that come after that through the apostles, there's a strong concept of grace and Jesus' grace being that which heals, that which saves, that which redeems. And then this author was writing a whole paper about this word grace, and he was talking about it's not just gift. It is actually a particular form of gift that is given to a close family member. So it is not just gift, it is actually a gift that is given either from a grandfather to a grandson, or from a mother-in-law to a daughter-in-law. For certain relationships in family, are the ones who are, when the gift is given in that fashion, then this particular word is used. But can you see how subtle it is? Even something as simple as translation, when you're translating it from a cultural setting that is 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, who has the authority to tell what this verse actually means, what we are talking about? When you actually just even try to look at that word from that lens, what was Jesus giving? It opens up a whole new world of how you even look at that word grace. He was giving a gift to those that were close to him, that were able to have that relationship with him. It was not just a random act of power flowing through him from God, which could also be another connotation of that word, but that's not how the Bible was presenting it. It was being presented in a very, very specific way. Again, I'm sharing all of this because the translation, the interpretation, all of this has to come from a place of spiritual authority. And who has that authority? The mystics have that authority. The saints have that authority. Now, the last part that I want to talk about before just giving more of an introduction into the different books and such is this whole confusion, or rather, I shouldn't say confusion, but this whole mixture when it comes to scripture of the different ways in which things are presented, of allegorical, of mythical, historical, and then finally, just even pure fiction or parables or things like that. And especially in the Old Testament, for the most part, from what I understand, at least the way Yogananda taught, everything we hear in the New Testament, the sequence of incidents that are narrated are actually historical in nature. They are not allegorical or mythical. But with the Old Testament, it's very hard to tell. It's very hard to tell where they're talking about everything is presented as if it's history, but it's really hard to know. In fact, again, in the last couple of days, because I've been reading a lot about this, there's this whole, I'm sure most of you know this, the Sodom and Gomorrah, the two cities that were destroyed because of evildoers. There's this whole research, so many people in the world like trying to figure out where are they located, and then what happened. Maybe there was a solar flare, and then there was, why was there sulfur? Maybe there was, just trying to reconcile what the scripture says with actual historic events, or being convinced that everything that the scripture says are literal in nature. Obviously, for those of us sitting in this room, we don't have that need to make everything literal. We have enough spiritual maturity to know that sometimes things can be communicated in other ways. Quite honestly, this is not something that is unique to Bible or to the Christian scripture. It is the same thing that you have with the Hindus or any tradition. Often, and there's a sense of ease around this in the Indian culture, I should say, perhaps even more than the West. So did Krishna really play flute here? Were all these was this a real incident when all the different gopis were actually dancing with one Krishna each, or was it just an image that was presented as a metaphor for, the relationship between soul and God? The answer is just yes and yes and yes, because I'm going to just not digress, but it's relevant. But to talk about the Hindu way of awakening, which is another masterful book that Swami wrote, Swami addresses this particular question of separating myth and history and allegory in a very interesting way in that book. And he writes about this over many chapters in the introduction to the book. And he talks about, and he does not address that question directly, because the question, when it is asked, is always coming from an intellectual point of view. I need to know. I just need to know. Did Sodom and Gomorrah, when the women turned back, they actually became pillars of salt? Like, was that just a symbolic representation? Did they physically turn into salt? I'm just trying to understand what really happened. But that question is often an intellectual quest. It is something that we are trying to absorb and understand from the mind, and the mind will never be able to understand the truth that is being presented by these scriptures. So Swami often goes back in that whole discussion to even question words like what is myth, what is true, what is false. And he leaves it a little bit open-ended, only implying that that line of questioning doesn't matter. That line of questioning doesn't matter, because what the scripture has to give us in terms of the understanding and the realization and the truth is going to be ours through our receptivity and through the guidance of somebody who's realized and who knows what they're talking about. It does not come from understanding what part of it was history, who was there, what happened, what did not happen, how it all transpired. Was it in 2600 BC or was it in 1200 BC? It's not going to come by from any of those details. Those are all so irrelevant compared to what that book carries for us today. That living presence and the vibration that has been carried through all these different generations. So now, with that very long introduction, what I wanted to do today is just to present a little bit of an overview of the Old Testament, the way Master brought it, and then also just introduce the New Testament perhaps a little bit. And from next week, we will actually go chronologically through the life of Christ, but also explore a lot of different yogic concepts that are being presented in Jesus' teachings, whether it's reincarnation, the idea of Kundalini, meditation, Kriya, and all of that. Before that, we don't have an audience mic, and we don't need one, but I was wondering if anybody wants to, you can share any thoughts you have on it, anything I said so far, but also your experience with the Bible, or just in general, how you have approached it, what you've gained from it, what role that it has played in your own life, whether it's through the yogic path and Yogananda's teachings, or before that, or independent of that, whatever it may be. Those of you that are watching online, I'm sorry, you'll have to come in person if you want to participate in the sharing. But if one or two of you want to share, just to bring more perspective in the room. Letty?
So I was raised Catholic. Always had a Bible in the house.
Mm-hmm.
Never read it. Never picked it up. I might have looked at it once, kind of opened it, thought, "What is this?" and closed it and put it back. And it wasn't really until, and David has the same, and we picked up the Bible when we actually got it. And it wasn't until we got here. So we would start our meditation, prayer, chanting, one whisper, Bible. And we just went in chronological order of the in church, what they were saying. Kept saying the same thing. So I'm hearing the same thing over and over, but I think this still doesn't make any sense. It wasn't until here that it actually started.
I'm going to just repeat briefly to summarize for the sake of the recording. somebody in the room was just sharing, they grew up Catholic, but never ever attempted to open or read the Bible. And even after having a copy and trying to read it and trying to reconcile with what was being shared in Christian churches, it just never made sense until they found these teachings, and after coming to Ananda, that somehow there was a context in which it started coming together. Anyone else? Sharmila?
Really, Old Testament, amazing to me. I loved it. Around me didn't seem to felt like no idea. Sunday, no relevance. I felt left it. Coming to this path, first seeing Christ. Back together.
Sharmila was just sharing here. She actually went to theological seminary to study the Bible and really tried to go deep with it, but somehow it felt like there was a gap between the theology of what the scripture was and what one was studying and the practical life and what they were facing on a day-to-day basis. It just felt like it never came together until she came to Ananda and found these teachings where there was an integration of the two, that one could live by these teachings. Anyone else? Kevin?
I want to thank you for something you said that really struck me, not to look at it from the intellectual standpoint, because I can tell you on my book stand, I have all these Bible commentaries and all the different Bibles, and I don't have the intellect to first realize all that. You know, you don't have to. What I heard, feel it, ear, but I don't hear regular Christian. We never picked up the Bible in our Catholic home either. And I saw one in my aunt's house once. They were Protestant. It was King James, and it was like, no, I really wanted to read it, but no, I think we were told not to read that by the nuns. It's horrible. Religion, organized,
Churchianity.
churchiality is really mess an inquisitive mind up. So thank you for that. I'm not going to be over
Kevin was just sharing, she really appreciated the idea that one doesn't have to intellectually analyze the scripture or even understand, but rather we are trying to tune in, feel, and receive, because you're speaking about your life, but that's just, I would say 90% of people who identify and feel passionately Christian is that there is a lot of, their way or understanding of tuning into scripture is through a theological quest. It's not through a devotional understanding of how to receive it. So she was just sharing that is an idea that's really resonating with her, and also that's perhaps even unique to how we approach things here. You're talking about Ananda, but I think that's also just a yogic way of looking at anything, because we are trying to go into the essence. Yesterday, Asha, in her talk, yesterday was, this is being recorded on March 8th, and yesterday, March 7th, 2023, was Yogananda's Mahasamadhi, and Asha in her talk was talking about this one line from the autobiography of a yogi before Yogananda has this experience in cosmic consciousness, or when he has that experience in cosmic consciousness. He says, I cognize the center of empyrean as a point of intuitive perception in my own heart. The center of all of creation in the universe He cognized it, he realized it, not understood or not, he realized it as a point of intuitive perception in his own heart, that the truth itself is perception. It's what you're bringing up is such an important point regarding even the word truth, because there is no reconciliation possible on so many levels between religions, between understanding, between ideas. Why is this sect believes in that, that sect doesn't believe in that, and so much of it cannot be reconciled on that level of diversity. It has to come from an intuitive realization or perception of truth. Chandra, you were going to say something? So Chandra is asking a question. She's asking, is Jesus merely representing the Christ conscious? He's not the Christ consciousness. Jesus, the best way I'm going to speak both from Master's teachings, but also because some of it is personally relating to it. Because, that interesting conversation between Devi Mukherjee and Yogananda, if you're one with God, aren't you God? I did not say that, but the conversation doesn't go anywhere. I know it might be cryptic for somebody who's watching. So Devi Mukherjee, one of Yogananda's disciples, asks Yogananda, are you God? You said you killed Yogananda many lifetimes ago. Nobody lives in this temple but God. So are you God? He said, I'm not God. No wave can claim that it is the ocean. But then he says, the scriptures say, one who is one with God is God. And Yogananda smiles and say, and so are you God? And Yogananda says, I didn't say that, the scriptures say that. And then the scriptures are true, right? So you must be God. So again, what I'm trying to say is, I think it's yes and yes. Jesus is Christ consciousness. He is not just a symbol, but also Jesus was a man who walked on earth. So Jesus incarnated in a human body. He was also, that's where we'll talk more about it in the upcoming classes, because it is such an important concept. Maybe we'll begin the next class with that. There's this idea of Son of Man and Son of God, and that's one of the controversies between Judaism and Christianity, why Jesus was considered blasphemous and why he was crucified. It's sort of central to all of that, because it's the same question which caused that whole controversy that led to Jesus being killed, which is, are you one with God? How can you claim that? How can you claim? And Jesus was in a human vehicle. He was a fully liberated, realized soul who was coming from that state of complete union with Christ consciousness. And yet there was also a human body and a human personality walking about, just joking. Go ahead.
I guess I all of a sudden felt like Babaji and I don't know why more than
it's hard for me to even comment on what you're saying, because it's truth. It's almost like it's so beyond me to even say what you're saying is true, because it is so beyond anything that is within my realm of experience or understanding. But it is speaking to the ultimate truth, because once I remember in a question and answer, probably in a renewal week or spiritual renewal week with Jyotish and Devi, somebody asked a somewhat slightly trickier, at least it was not a clear question. They were talking about how they were able to tune into Larry Marsha this particular way and Yukteswar Giri this particular way and this and that. And then I remember Jyotish looked at this person trying to address that question and just said, the more I've been on this path, I wish I could find that recording. I was there physically in person, I remember. He said, the 5 gurus are not separate or different. The 5 gurus are not separate or different. They are one and the same. But when I say something like that, I'm repeating someone else, or I'm communicating an idea which is so beyond me to comment on. That's all I can say. But all that said, I'll also say, in a very interesting way, because this is where it becomes real for all of us in our own lives. I know many people in our community have been inspired, around the world have been inspired with this new series called Chosen, about the life of Jesus. And, here you are talking about an avatar who's so beyond everything, who's one with Christ consciousness. You're talking about a consciousness that is present in the center of every atom in creation. But then how inspiring it is to watch, to not just watch, but to think of, he walked on this ground. He spoke to this person, and then he said that, and then he did that, and then he went to this particular town, and then these children came to him, and then he healed this blind man. And then just to think about that, because we still live on that level. These are ideas to us. These are... We are not living in any of these realities of just even knowing what it means to be one with Christ consciousness. We are still sort of, our life is all about, my son is not feeling well, I'm not happy with my job, I'm having a surgery next week. And then the light descends, and then, the masters play our role, and it's not incidental. Because I think it is not practical or often even helpful for us to try to tune into the abstract, because they play this human role. We put so many pictures of, yesterday Atmajyoti and Kamala Devi were doing the altar for Masters Mahasamadhi. They were putting more pictures than they were there, because, we are going to have a rose petal ceremony, and they brought the big picture of Yogananda out. And before they came, I thought the altar was the same. It was already done for the event. But then when they put more pictures there, when they put the big picture, I was so happy, because I thought, oh, that'll be so sweet, because we are going to offer rose petals at the end, and it'll be very nice. But then, I'm remembering or mentioning that right now but it's a picture. It's not even Yogananda. We are saying that Yogananda is not even that body, but what to speak even of that picture? It's just that, but that picture is somehow a doorway for inspiration for us. It is through the picture we are tuning into that incarnation that the Infinite Spirit had in the form of Yogananda, that walked on this plane for 60 years. And through that incarnation, we are tuning into the Christ consciousness, and through that, into infinity. And so those links, I think, are vital for us. That picture is so vital for us, because it is through that, it is all the stories in the Bible, through that we tune into the presence of Christ. Without that, it just wouldn't be as real to us. One of my favorite lines, which I like to quote often from the book God Alone by Gyanamata, is in one of the letters, she says, these are her exact words, writing to a disciple about what the guru-disciple relationship is. She says, the guru comes onto this plane only as much as I come to you through this letter. You receive a letter from somebody, that's not them. They wrote that letter to you. But if I write a letter to you, I don't come to you through that email, but I do. The same way, the guru is never in that form, but the form is a reflection, it's a message, it's a doorway, it's a means through which we have a way to connect. The email is a way through which you can feel connected to me. I'm not actually staring at you through your computer screen, but there is something coming from that plane that makes it real to you. In the same way, I think these great avatars come onto the material plane. It is a reflection, because everything on this plane is just a reflection. But the reflection is not incidental or irrelevant, because that reflection is our doorway. That incarnation of Christ and all that we have in the Bible is our doorway to tune into that state of consciousness, because otherwise that is so abstract and beyond any of our understanding. So with that, I'm going to briefly just share a few things, and then we will finish for this evening. Just in terms of, I just feel a little odd bringing us to the mundane details of it. We won't share a lot, but I just wanted to present context, because I also want people who have no familiarity with the Bible to get some basic foundation set through this course, so that you can have more of a context on how to understand it. Hey, Michael. So the Old Testament, I'm going to give like a brief 3-minute summary of what is relevant for us. It starts with a couple of different books. I'm going to mention that briefly because Yogananda, Yukteswar, all of them taught both from the book Genesis and Revelations. These are two books that come from the earlier part. I'll mention that briefly. But later on, there's just a lot of stories of many, 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 many different prophets. It all starts with this one prophet named Abraham. And Abraham had a covenant with God that his descendants would inherit this promised land. And they were going to be the chosen people of God. And then they were somehow going to, so he himself was a God-realized soul, Abraham. Master affirmed it himself. And so through that, his descendants would finally be in this promised land. And this is, again, through the teachings of Jesus and the Old Testament, this is another point of contention. As Yogananda taught, the land and what is being referred to in the Old Testament is not physical. It's not actually a piece of land. And that's another important part of Jesus' message, because the kingdom, as Jesus referred to later on in his teachings, is inside. It is not actually talking about the physical land. In the Old Testament, the Judaic interpretation of it is referring to actually the country of Israel, and there's a lot around Zion and many of those things, and that's how this whole covenant with Abraham is interpreted in that particular tradition. So again, we move on. There's a lot of tests that God puts Abraham through in order to seal the covenant. We are going to pass through all of that. And then 3 generations after Abraham, his descendants moved to Egypt. And then soon, after a few generations after that, they are all enslaved by the pharaohs of Egypt, from being these really God-realized people that had this very privileged incarnation of being born in the bloodline of somebody who was so highly evolved. They are now being slaves to the kings and the rulers of Egypt. And then, fast forward hundreds of years later, there is this other man named Moses, who's, again, Master said he was an avatar. He was a fully liberated Master himself, who again incarnated amongst the descendants of Abraham. And he was the chosen one to liberate these people from the hold of these pharaohs, from the rulers of Egypt. So, again, I'm going to give you the 3-second version of Moses. He leads his people. He parts the Red Sea. That is the famous miracle that he performed that defined the whole Jewish tradition, and a lot of observations are centered around the people from Egypt moving over back to the promised land, which is Israel in this context. So Moses leads his people back. Moses goes on Mount Sinai, and that's where he is in direct communion with God, and then he receives the 10 commandments that are given to him through, directly from God. And then he gives it to his people. And there are a lot of prophets that come after that. I'm not going to mention any of those names, just like Sanskrit names. They are not always relevant to everything that we need to know or study. But I think that context is perhaps the most important in what we need to know regarding Abraham and Moses, because Jesus later on, hundreds of years later, comes from that same lineage. Now, to give some more context for the big picture of what is happening, through this entire time, Moses receiving the 10 commandments directly from God and all the different prophets that came after that, the whole idea of religion is becoming more and more rule-bound. Everywhere in the Old Testament, a lot of random rules are getting added along the way. And by the time Jesus comes, I think they're already looking at a number of 600 rules that people needed to observe in order to be in tune with God, in order to practice religion. And so clearly they veered away quite far from the true revelation of Abraham or Moses. In fact, one of the striking features of Jesus, the New Testament and what Jesus teaches, he does not invalidate anything that came before him. He does not invalidate any of what Abraham taught or Moses taught. It almost reminds one of the generosity with which Yogananda always spoke of other great spiritual teachers. He never invalidated. He often offered a lot of correctives. We will discuss some of that, in the upcoming classes. He did have to do a lot of course correction, but he never disagreed with the masters themselves. He was coming in the line of Abraham and Moses in order to carry the same message from God, in order to lead people back to God. But of course, by this point, the institutional religion, which we have been talking about for all this time, had gotten heavily confused. It had gotten very confused in the sense of completely losing its purpose, being all rule-bound, and especially this understanding that this is all about this one territory of land that has been inherited. And that is the fundamental understanding of the faith that was derived from the Old Testament. And Jesus incarnated to correct all of that. So that's, that's your 3-minute summary of the Old Testament. There are a couple of things that I want to talk about, which is more esoteric. We'll perhaps end there. I don't think I'll have time to start with the New Testament today. The two things that I want to talk about, one is Genesis and Revelation. There are a lot of notes I have, but I probably won't go through all of that. But just to briefly give some yogic perspective on these things, I mentioned some time ago that even Swamiji in his writing talked about a lot of high teachings contained in the Old Testament, but Yogananda did not interpret it. And then he said Dr. Lewis often was able to because of his expertise and also attunement with Yogananda. So there's a lot in there, and there are some that Yogananda directly talks about in his teachings. I wanted to make brief mentions of it. Again, not to go into an intellectual study, but in case you're interested in knowing more of what he taught from the Bible, you can either ask me or you can explore this. You know, the first one, looking for my phone, give me a second. The first one I want to talk about is the Genesis itself, because this is a very, very famous instance from the autobiography of a yogi, where Yukteswar and Yogananda are having this conversation. It almost sounds a little bit staged because Yogananda is very naive and he's asking these questions to Yukteswar, and Yukteswar explains the nature of Genesis and creation. There is a lot of symbolic meaning that Yogananda offers in his commentary of the Genesis. I won't go into all of that right now. Again, if you're interested in more of what I'm sharing, just write to me. I can just send you excerpts from Yogananda's writings on these subjects. I think some of it is a little dry to necessarily discuss in a class, or perhaps esoteric. It's not as inspiring or just devotional. That would be appropriate for a satsang like this. But the story of Adam and Eve, which again Yukteswar talks about in the autobiography of a yogi, is one that is actually not just insightful, but I think it has a lot of deep meaning on the yogic path. I think most of us know the basic premise of the story. There was this Garden of Eden, and there was this apple tree. You're not supposed to eat this apple, and the snake confuses Eve, and then now they ended up eating the apple, and now they're doomed forever. So that's that's the gist of what you get from the book of Genesis. And then Yukteswar Giri, in the autobiography of Yogi, it's a very long explanation that he offers for the story from the Bible of what Genesis really means. And I'm going to read a little bit from Yukteswar's own words. But in essence, he talks about the whole story as being allegorical. In fact, the book starts by saying, man was made in the image of God. What does that even mean? And oftentimes, the traditional interpretation of churchianity is an anthropomorphic version of God, which is that if man was made an image of God, then the way your mind works, then God looks like me. So God is an old guy with a very long white beard. He couldn't possibly be young. But that's not what it is talking about. In fact, perhaps if I have time, I'll read it in Swami's own words in another class. Swami talks about in detail in Revelations of Christ. What it's talking about is what we have on the altar as a spiritual eye, above the altar, the blue sphere and the 5-pointed star. The 5-pointed star is not just an incidental symbol or somehow a symbol that is specific to any tradition or path. It represents the design of the human person. It represents our own innate reality. And when we are able to pierce into the subtle spinal channels, then we draw our consciousness away from the material plane into the golden light, which is the astral plane, and then the blue light, which is the causal plane, and then the 5-pointed star within. And this whole process of samadhi, again, I'm sharing with you the writings of Swami Kriyananda, nothing from my own personal experience here. What we are talking about is piercing or entering that five-pointed star. That's how it's described. And the five-pointed star represents the five poles of the human body itself, the two limbs, the two hands, the two legs, and the head. They represent a five-pointed star, and you are merging and you're piercing through that veil of Christ consciousness, not veil, through that point of Christ consciousness to transcend into infinity. That's the process of liberation itself. So the doorway, which is that five-pointed star, which is what Christ consciousness is an image of man. That's what it means. So coming back to the story of Adam and Eve and Genesis, so Adam and Eve represent the polarity in human nature. This is how Yukteswar Giri explains. I'll in a bit read his own words. And the Garden of Eden represents the garden of when spirit descended onto the material plane, when pure spirit condensed to a state in which it was starting to relate to an external reality that was defined by the senses. So man himself descended, and he was now relating to the world through the senses. That was a garden of infinite beauty. That was a garden of infinite beauty that he had every right and privilege to enjoy. And that's what Adam and Eve represent, the inherent duality of creation that descended onto the material plane that was bound by the senses. It was infinitely beautiful. And they could have had this beauty forever through eternity, but they couldn't indulge in this one fruit. This one fruit, in fact, there's so much allegory in all of it. This fruit is a condensation of all of this sensory involvement, because it's not just one random fruit. What is the fruit in a garden? The fruit is, even the word fruit, is a crux. It's the epitome of everything that the tree represents. The tree exists for the fruit. The fruit is not an incidental part of a tree. The very existence of the tree is for the fruit. So all of the sensory plane culminates in this one pleasure, which is that of sexuality. And again, I want to be very careful in how we see or interpret or apply these teachings. This is not a commentary against sexuality or, somehow talking about celibacy or anything like that. It is representing a very fundamental principle of creation itself. Until Adam and Eve, until that duality descended, until it did not descend into that fruit of sexuality, this garden of senses could be one's own for eternity. But when they indulged, because what it represents, I know I'm going very fast here, but I'll try to slow down a little bit and I'll read because I'm looking at the clock, but it's okay. What it's representing is the commitment of the Kundalini energy, which is at the base of the spine. Again, I'm not going through a detailed explanation of anatomy and all these subtle concepts here in this class. But again, any of you can write to me. I can send you explanations or excerpts from Yogananda's writings on these things. We are talking about this downward pull of energy, which primarily is contained and kept under the coccyx by the force of sexuality. So the Kundalini energy cannot be liberated. It is kept bound because of that element of sexuality at the base of the spine. So the indulgence that it is representing, that Adam and Eve should not fall prey to, is that particular commitment of energy at the base of the spine, which once they have been drawn into, now locks them into the cycle of reincarnation, into suffering, into that world of Maya that is going to perpetuate over and over again through their own progeny. Now, before you ask any questions, I'm going to just read a little bit from Yukteswar Giri's explanation, because it perhaps states it more clearly than even I did. Genesis is deeply symbolic. This is Yukteswar Giri speaking, and cannot be grasped by a literal interpretation. Its tree of life is the human body. The spinal cord is an upturned tree with the man's hair as its roots and efferent nerves as its branches. I don't know what that means. The trees of the nervous system bears many enjoyable fruits or sensations of sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. In these, man may rightfully indulge, but he was forbidden the experience of sex, the apple at the center of the bodily organ. The serpent represents the coiled up spinal energy which stimulates the sex nerves. Adam is reason, Eve is feeling. When the emotion or Eve consciousness in a human being is overpowered by the sex impulse, his reason or Adam also succumbs. So there's a lot more explanation that comes after that. This is all from the autobiography of a yogi. You can even easily find it through a Google search. But even that very story of Genesis, Yukteswar Giri offers this explanation. There's a lot more in the book of Genesis that both Yukteswar and Master spoke about, but I won't go into a lot of detail. But this one is a particularly clear and self-evident image that is very central to the yogic path. We do have to be careful in how we read it, and in Swami's Gita commentary, he actually goes into greater detail with all of this. If you were to just look at the literal or the symbolic, allegorical interpretation of it, it does. You cannot help but imagine that it is condemning sexuality. In a way it is, but it's also not negating human nature, because one cannot transcend that by suppressing it. It represents an active movement of energy and an understanding of the polarity in the human spine, which we are all one day destined to transcend. So that's really what it represents. It's not about, a particular practice of celibacy or this or that, somehow that's going to lead us to liberation. We ultimately have to transcend every impulse of the ego. Any thoughts or questions on that before I move on? Yes, Michael?
One thing that's interesting to me is similarities to the Ramayana.
Uh-huh.
Like if you think about the apple, like Adam and Eve collectively as the ego, right? And then you think of like the apple as, so in the Ramayana, the ego is Ravana, right? And then the apple is Sita, right? And that's what sets in motion kind of this.
Yeah, I mean, it's different from Yukteswar Giri's interpretation, but a scripture can have many allegorical layers to it, like you're describing. I'm going to share one last thing before we finish, because I said I was also going to briefly mention the book of Revelations. In the Holy Science, Yukteswar Giri draws a lot of parallels between, he says, the Christian Bible and the Hindu scriptures, but mostly what he draws from, interestingly, if you did not know, is from the book of Revelations. A little bit from Genesis and very little from John, but a lot of it is from the book of Revelations. I'll just read a few verses which don't require a lot of explanation, because some of it is beyond me to even try to explain. So these are all direct translations of the book of Revelations. You will see why they are directly correlated to the yogic science and the yogic truths that's the same as the Indian scriptures. Revelations 1, 12, 13, 16, 20, and 21. And being turned, I saw 7 golden candlesticks, and in the midst of 7 candlesticks, one like unto the Son of Man, and he had in his right hand 7 stars. The mystery of the 7 stars which thou sawest in my right hand, and the 7 golden candlesticks. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 candlesticks which thou sawest are the 7 churches. These things saith he that holdeth the 7 stars in his right hand, who walketh in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks. I was going to pick a different verse, but this page opened. I could read Yukteswar Giri's explanation for this verse, but honestly, his explanation is not all that different from the original Revelations verse itself. But, he's talking about the 7 spheres of existence and the 7 chakras, and he talks about how the book of Revelations is reflecting the same teachings. So that's what I meant. If you were to pick up the Bible, and if this is what reading the Bible meant to you, maybe that's what this is an example for. It will be rather uninspiring and perhaps not a productive use of your time. there is a lot more. Most of what he quotes from the book of Revelations is like that because it's extremely cryptic. I'm going to restrain my own instinct to read more from the book of Revelations. But if you're interested, you can pick up the Holy Signs. Most of it is fairly esoteric. But you can grasp some ideas here and there if it is of interest to you. I've personally found it a little bit too not only esoteric, but just a little too abstract to necessarily grasp or do much with. But of course, Yukteswar Giri tries to go into a lot of explanations of what the 7 churches are, what the 7 candlesticks are, why is it he holding in the right hand, and who is the Son of Man, and he goes on and on explaining all of this. Again, going back to what Kevin was sharing, perhaps it'll just be an intellectual pursuit unless any of this is actually part of our meditative experience. I think in truth, if I were to speak for myself and perhaps where most of us come from, there's a lot more inspiration to be derived from the life of Jesus, which is what we'll get to next week. And even in the way, even looking at the Old Testament through the eyes of Christ's teaching, of how Jesus presents them in the 4 canonical Gospels, and especially through all the things that transpired, between his birth and death and all the sequence of events that led to that and his resurrection. And there's also a lot which I don't think we will get to explore in this class series. But even after Christ's passing, the story of Paul, and there's so much of the Bible that comes after Christ resurrects. We may not get a chance to go through that. But again, perhaps also because it is 2,000 years old and not 4,000 or 3,500, it's a little more relatable, and that part of the Bible is fairly historical. So it's much more relatable as a human experience. Whereas, here it's talking about people going to 7 churches, but it's not historical. It is purely symbolic and esoteric. So there's not a lot that we can relate to from our own experience. So with that, we will finish for today. And next week it'll be more fun because I'll have Nawashan with me, and we'll also have lyric sheets. We might do some all sings, and we will pick some of Swami's music from the oratorio, and we will start exploring the life of Christ. We will end the online meeting now, but if people in the room have anything to say or share, you can. Thank you, friends, for joining.